The Work and Thought of René Guénon by Massimo Scaligero. To come into contact with the work of René Guénon is like entering a world of order, clarity, and at times even transparency. In the inquiry into the spiritual, one is summoned to a method reminiscent of the mathematical, one that is won for the author the assent of the most serious researchers. In certain circles of pure culture, he is moreover regarded as the greatest guide toward the science of tradition. For anyone who lacks some experience of metaphysical knowing, this work immediately gives the impression of a sphere in which he might encounter his own conscious principle, whereas someone who has begun, in some measure, to have such an experience finds projected into singularly precise conceptual distinctions the elusive value of knowledge. One finds that Guénon possesses a particular capacity to discriminate the metaphysical from the physical, the infinite from the indefinite, the universal from the individual. Yet this occurs on a purely dialectical level, that is, by means of representations that may be preliminarily useful, but which, from a practical methodological standpoint, do not advance one a single step beyond the world of words toward that universal, towards that metaphysical. In this direction, reading his work, Considerazioni sulla via iniziatica, published in Italy by the Bocca brothers of Milan, in Corrado Rocco's excellent translation, who also provided the introduction, we find a synthesis that may truly be considered the nucleus of his inner experience. As long as knowledge limits itself to the mental, it is only a simple knowledge by reflection, like that of the shadows seen by the prisoners in Plato's symbolic cave. Therefore, an indirect and entirely exterior knowledge. To pass from shadow to reality, grasped directly in itself, is precisely to pass from the exterior to the interior, and also from the particular point of view we are adopting here, from virtual initiation to effective initiation. This passage implies the renunciation of the mental. Now, while the image of the unreality of reflected knowledge in comparison with the reality of direct knowledge is indeed correct, it is not possible to deduce from it the passage from virtual initiation to effective initiation. From such knowledge, this passage has merely begun. It has not been realized. Nor does it truly involve a renunciation of the mental, but rather an immediate, original possession of the force that expresses itself in the mental, and which the profane man grasps only in the final phase of its process, when it may be said to be derealized. Whoever renounces the mental frees himself from a force that, for the integration of the personality, ought instead to be possessed at its root. Guénon, in truth, confuses the experience of a liberated or disenchanted mental sphere with that which, under conditions of ineffability, preludes identity with the absolute. From the standpoint of the being who accomplishes the return, there is something like a distance between these two degrees, and confusion between them is possible precisely because of the grandeur and inner self-affirmation experienced at the first level, when one does not sufficiently know its meaning, scope, or limit. Thus one risks believing oneself already initiated, and even appearing to be so, while only certain fundamental intellectual prerequisites are present. The acquisition of pure metaphysical knowledge is certainly not initiation, but only a first degree. When realized, it provides an initial condition for identification with the absolute, an experience that requires entirely different esoteric developments, although a kind of partial identity may occur in the form of intellectuality possessed as a pure function. Yet it is precisely in relation to the comprehension of the value of such intellectuality that the ultimate sense of Guénon's work becomes perceptible. The summit of his ascent is a mental transparency not recognized as such, still bearing human limits, which become evident when he confuses this transparency with effective initiation, and when, in his work, feeling compelled to refer to a method, he continually points to a transcendence and at the same time to tradition, indeed to a traditional organization, and, forgetting the individual in himself, seeks to recover the primordial source. It is useful to read two of Guénon's works, Les états multiples de l'être and Les principes du calcul infinitésimal, in order to appreciate his admirable subtlety of thought, but also its limit. The essential content is the persistent allusion to the sense of the infinite, which demands a mode of knowing different from the ordinary, and in this regard one cannot but agree. Yet concerning the spatio-temporal cosmos, which in truth is a finite, indefinitely measurable, it is strange that Guénon fails to see how every further extension of an indefinite series is nothing other than the conceptual movement of our thought applied to its representation. Only our normal thought can conceive one more unit beyond the highest number reached, and it alone reaches a limit that is merely thought and surpassed only dialectically, that is, by further thoughts. Now, it seems that Guénon reaches the idea of the infinite in no different a way. Mentally attained, it remains always an abstraction. The author's acute logic arrives at most at the transparent purity of such an abstraction, remaining within the sphere of mental conceptions and transferring the infinite to a thought transcendence no differently than he has thought the finite. Simultaneously, owing to an incomplete possession of the metaphysical genesis of the thinking involved, he shows the irrelevance of this thinking's original belonging to that same universality, which he metaphysically seeks and which he conceptually excludes from the sphere of his own possibilities. Let us attempt to clarify this. When one arrives at a transparent abstraction regarding an object, one unmistakably reveals the limit of one's knowledge, if one does not show that the cognitive act, that is, the supersensible perception of the object, occurs not by means of a thought out, which is Guénon's knowledge by reflection, but by means of the very essence and movement of thinking itself. When possessed in its pre-dialectical phase, this thinking bears within itself the same intimate life of the object and, independently of the object, reveals its immediate conformity to the universal and the infinite from which it directly draws its law, a law which normal man continually violates through his limited egoity. Guénon, seen in the light of a true knowledge, effectively reveals the incompleteness of his supramental vision when he distinguishes on the one hand a limited thinking and on the other a transcendent accessible by a path that eliminates thinking, because he does not know how to remove its limits, yet he makes this very distinction by means of such thinking. In the two-sided works it is evident that he conceives multiplicity, the finite, movement as something self-contained, circumscribed within its own order, which is, however, illusory if not referred to a superior, transcendent principle, like Aristotle's unmoved mover. But we must ask, what transcendence? What superior principle? In fact, the question seems posed not by an esotericist, but by a philosopher of esoteric dialectics, as though transcendence and so-called exterior reality stood facing one another separated, and man were a third term in an attitude of acquiescence or denial. How can Guénon give directives regarding initiatic orthodoxy when he does not grasp the ultimate meaning of modern man's agnosticism, and when he poses the question of transcendence with a mode of thinking that claims to be esoteric but is unconsciously woven from this very agnosticism? The question of transcendence is posed only by man who no longer has knowledge. Multiplicity is such only for man. Separation is a fact that concerns only human perceiving and thinking. Therefore, the resolution of every duality is possible only for him who experiences that duality, and only in the seat where he experiences it. This duality will never be resolved along the line of a philosophical or esoteric dialectic that considers it true outside man, nor by means of some intermediary dualizing element, be it traditional science, rite, yoga, or magic. This esotericism that does not take a step beyond the theological mystical limit is too easy, even though it claims to surpass it through a knowledge that on the one hand discursively alludes to a path of pure intellectuality, and Guénon insists upon this in every work, and on the other shows its insufficiency by referring back to a traditional organization, to a tradition, that is, to a new external authority. The form of the limit changes, but the limit remains identical. The simplism of such a direction explains today's spiritualists who need dialectical, traditional, or ritual pretexts to evade the problem of metaphysical freedom and to avoid radically confronting themselves. They are those whom a thinker who does not write rightly calls the chatterers of the spirit, whose function is to delay both themselves and others through the indefiniteness of words. Guénon shows that he lacks the forces necessary to understand how the mental process that led him to the clear ideation of the infinite, when diverted from its object and considered in itself, perceived in itself, is itself the direction toward the infinite. And this is a very rare key, which may nonetheless be offered without adopting the posture of a master. But when not recognizing this possible direction, he turns, so as to leave the series of words and pass to action, to a new mediation, wholly external to the pure ideation set in motion. He substantially contradicts the finest achievements of his thinking process, asking of a thing among things, of an externality, what he should have asked to the very end of that creative thinking. In his critical work, Mascera e volto dello spiritualismo contemporaneo, la terza Bari, Julius Evola attributes to Guénon the idea of a primordial metaphysical tradition, of non-human character, whose elements may be found throughout all that in the teachings, symbols, rites, dogmas, or myths of particular historical traditions is susceptible of being elevated to a meaning of objectivity and universality. Yet even granting the positivity of this idea, it must be recalled to Julius Evola, as to René Guénon, that within the inner constitution of modern man there exists a fracture that makes tradition appear as an external doctrinal ritual corpus rather than as a superhuman current of life into which he may immerse himself in order to relive. In modern man lives the error that separates the transcendent from the world of the senses, so that he perceives the latter as devoid of the divine. Therefore, reintegration cannot occur through a form of initiation that precedes the epoch in which this error became an accomplished fact. Any type of initiation from another epoch, any traditional path not taken up in order to recognize within oneself an ancient individual, truly psychic, depositary of all that in us must truly be overcome and rectified, containing the roots of all sentimental mysticism, of all asceticism without freedom, or of all magical pragmatism, will instead strengthen this ancient individual and exclude its autonomous knower, that is, the Redeemer, the conscious principle that for now lives only in the shadows of thoughts. To hypnotize men with the mirage of tradition and of an orthodox organization that transmits initiation means to paralyze that possibility of liberation and conquest of freedom, which for contemporary man lies precisely in the fact that he has reached the final rung of knowledge, that he has become conscious exactly where the gods, the oracles, the myths, the initiatic transmissions no longer act. Julius Evola does indeed feel such a motive. The most convincing aspect of his work is precisely the demand for freedom, which is instead lacking in the cosmos of René Guénon, for whom there exists a transcendent ordering of the world, and initiation is the path by which man realizes conformity to that transcendence. Thus he provides an initiatic scheme according to a dialectically recovered tradition, and without doubt in the most orthodox form.